We continue our reading this morning with Paul's letter to the Philippians. Let's continue attending to God's word. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is anything of excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Pastor Julian Sherman was having a good morning. No, it was a great morning. He had woken up before his alarm. He had downed an entire pot of coffee by himself. He had skimmed the morning news, and there was nothing too horribly bad in the news today, and he had had a nice, quiet commute to the office, and when he got out of his car at the Presbyterian church, he said out loud, and to no one in particular, "I love fall." The air was crisp, and the sun was shining, and it was going to be a good day. His assistant, Cheryl, had other ideas about that. She caught him in the hallway. "Pastor, Carl Wilkins is in your office." This day was not going to be what he thought it was going to be. "Why did you let him in the office?" And she just stood there with her hands on her hips. "He just walked in, and what am I supposed to do? I'm 5'0", he's a giant." Carl Wilkins was a giant in more than just stature. You did not have to wonder if Carl Wilkins was in the room. He made his presence known. Julian would never forget the first time he had met Carl. They were at the meet and greet after the service where he came to try out as pastor of the congregation. Carl was the very first person in line. He passed up punch and cookies to be the first person to talk to the pastor. His mammoth hand engulfed Julian's, almost crushing it as he introduced himself. "Carl Wilkins. Carl with a K, Carl Wilkins." On Julian's first day in the office 5 years ago, Carl was the very first appointment that he had. He just wanted to make sure that the pastor knew about all the people. "I just want you to be prepared, all right?" When Carl showed up, the world stopped. Julian loved all of God's children, but he did silently pray most mornings that Carl Wilkins would not come into the office. God had chosen this day to not answer the prayer. He steeled himself and he walked into the office. "Carl, good morning. What can I do for you?" "Good morning, Pastor." The man who greeted him there was not the Carl that he had come to know. This man was somber. This man was quiet. This man was small. His ordinarily furrowed brow was even more furrowed. He looked at Julian and he said, "Pastor, I'm afraid I might have made a mess of things." Julian said, "Oh?" Carl says, "It's the rummage sale." Now, the church rummage sale was the highlight of the church's calendar during the year. The amount of money raised for the missions committee at the rummage sale was astounding, and that's because it was a massive undertaking. In his first year, Julian went down to the social hall to view the proceedings, and he ended up retreating back to his office in terror. Bodies were everywhere. Tables were everywhere. Things were barely organized and sorted. Rummage was not even an accurate description of the proceedings. Julian likened it to a Good Friday sale, but he also wondered if there was any way he could get all of those people to show up on a Sunday morning, and he hadn't figured that one out yet. The rummage sale was always organized by a committee headed up by two people. This year it was Carl and another longtime member named Evelyn Drury. Julian smelled trouble at the very first meeting of the rummage sale committee when Carl and Evelyn just could not seem to agree on much of anything, up to and including who was running the meeting. Things began collegially, but they quickly went downhill, and people in the room were visibly uncomfortable. While he wasn't excited about it, Julian was not surprised to see Carl in his office that morning. He had been cornered by Evelyn a few days ago after the worship service. Reverend Sherman, I just don't think this is going to work out. That man is ruining the rummage sale. Ruining, he says. Ruining, Evelyn? Really? Ruining? Truly, Reverend. The rummage sale has been happening for as long as anybody can remember, probably longer than you've been alive, and it has been successful precisely because it runs like a Swiss watch. Now, Carl, this man just wants to upend everything. Pastor, this is not the time for creativity. There are certain things that need to happen at certain times and in certain ways, and if we don't do those things, we are going to have a disaster on our hands. Now, Julian was normally skeptical of people who talked about disaster and ruin, but Evelyn Drury was not among those he would have pegged for those kind of people. In his experience, Evelyn was the kind of person you called when you were in a jam because she knew how to get you out of it. He loved being in meetings with Evelyn Drury. To say she was creative would be an understatement. He didn't fully comprehend how her brain worked, but it seemed like every time she spoke, she was helping the group see past a minor issue, helping them focus on the larger thing they should be mindful of. And so if Evelyn Drury was panicked about the rummage sale, he knew he should probably listen. Something like the rummage sale had to be executed properly, if for no other reason than that the missions committee counted on the money made every year. Julian would be the first to admit he had a predisposition to seek out new and creative ways of doing things, but you just don't fix something unless it's broken, and he was prepared to say as much. And then Evelyn continued, so Pastor, I need you to talk to him because I don't think he cares about this event. I don't think he actually wants it to succeed. And that's when the red flags went up for Julian. People getting crossways, fine. That's just church life, fine. Getting our feelings hurt, absolutely. That's par for the course of what it means to be human. But he'd been pastor long enough to know that when people started telling themselves stories about other people and their motivations, bad things were coming. So he asked, have you talked to him? Oh, no, Evelyn replied. She grabbed her cardigan and wrapped it around herself like she was wrapping it in a cocoon. You can't talk to men like Carl. When they get an idea, they just won't let it go. You know what I'm talking about? He told her he didn't actually know what she was talking about, but that there was also very little that he could do for her if she hadn't addressed it herself. But now, Carl was in his office. On a beautiful autumn morning, Carl was in his office, and he was looking defeated, and he started to wonder if maybe he should have stepped in when Evelyn asked him to. And so he gently shut the door. Carl, what do you mean you made a mess of things? And he saw a single, solitary tear well up in the corner of Carl's eye. And that's when he realized there's probably a lot more to Carl than he knew or understood. Like Evelyn, he had allowed himself to tell a story about this giant of a man, about who he was, that he was impervious to everything, but here he was broken and he was in pain. I got this call from Evelyn last night about the rummage sale. Well, she said she didn't want to work with me anymore and that one of us needed to quit. She said she didn't care which one of us it was, but that I needed to tell her today because we have this meeting tonight and one of us needs to not be there. The tear in the corner of his eye had welled up so big that it had crested the edge of his eyelash. It was slowly making its way down his cheek. And he said, I just don't understand what happened. I've been having so much fun getting ready for this sale. I mean, we're doing some new and some pretty exciting things, and now she says she doesn't want me to be a part of it anymore. Julian had to admit it was easy to forget that guys like Carl had feelings because he rarely put them on display. He started to realize that the bluster of Carl was really just a clever defense mechanism to shield him, probably from pain and rejection. A lot of people were like that. They appear rough and prickly, but in truth, they're really, really sensitive. He never really stopped to consider that the people who seem tough and rigid are just plain scared, and they just don't know what to do with the fear and the anxiety coursing through their veins, and so we treat them harshly, thinking they won't be affected by it at all. But it was like his mother used to tell him, "You know, Julian, the bull never asked to be let loose in the china shop." He asked Carl, "Did she say anything more? I mean, I know your meetings have been a little rocky to start, but I thought you all were making some pretty good progress." And Carl said, "Well, I did too. I mean, Pastor, you got to know, I was honored to be one of the chairs of this event. Nobody asks me to do things like this. I always get stuck doing buildings and grounds kind of work, and I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to. I've spent a lifetime in construction, but that's not everything I am. It's not the only thing I care about." And so to have somebody think that I could do something like this, I'm telling you, it was an honor, and it's an honor that I don't want to screw up. I just want us to do it better than we've ever done it. That's what I'm trying to do, make suggestions to improve some things. I thought I was being helpful, but it turns out I wasn't. It's like she's got no inclination to listen to any new ideas. She just wants to do it the same way we've always done it. "Pastor, I don't know what to do." And that's when Julian had to suppress a smile. And not because he thought the situation was funny, because it wasn't. It's because he realized that Carl and Evelyn had entered into a classic church conversation. It was so classic, he was embarrassed he hadn't spotted it before. Because when you know what you're looking for, it's as easy to see as a thunderstorm coming across the prairie. Two people want the same thing, but they have different ideas about how to get there. It could be about budget, strategic direction. It could be about Advent hymns or literally the color of the carpet. It didn't matter. The problem was never what people thought it was about. It was always about the relationship between the two of them and how they deal with their fears inside of them. So it would have been nice if he had stepped in with Evelyn the other day, but he would have just been avoiding a deeper issue. Julian could have kicked himself. This was not about the rummage sale. He asked Carl, "Do you mind if I tell you a Bible story?" Carl kind of cocked his head. Confused look on his face was all the reaction Julian needed. "I suppose so." "I promise, Carl, it's going to make sense." So the Apostle Paul had this relationship with a lot of churches, right? And he wrote them all the time. It seemed like every letter he was writing, he was getting on them about something. About their selfishness, about their arrogance, that kind of thing. Almost every letter that he wrote was some version of stop making Jesus look bad by being awful and mean to each other. But there was this one church that was different, Carl. It was a church in a place called Philippi. He had a relationship with them unlike any of the others. There was just something about this church. I don't want to say Paul loved them more, but he had a special relationship. For instance, they were the only church that would send him money for his missionary journeys. Well, why is that? Well, because, Paul actually told people not to do it. He was a bit of a freak about it. He didn't want his message to be cheapened by the fact that people might think they were paying for it. But the Philippians didn't listen to him. It was a special place. They loved him. They seemed to get it more than anybody else did. I don't think Paul would tell us that they were perfect, but they didn't seem to have the kinds of issues that other churches had. At least Paul didn't write to them like they had those issues. And anyway, there were these two people at this church, one named Euodia and one named Syntyche. They were two women who were looked up to as leaders, and Paul says that while he was there, he discovered they were having a conflict, and so he wrote the church about it. Wait a second. He wrote about these two women in a letter that's going to be read in front of everybody? Yeah, Julian said. Well, that sounds like hell, Carl said. And he pointed his finger right at Julian. If you ever do that to me, I am leaving. He says, fair enough, Carl, fair enough. Anyway, we don't know what's happening, but whatever's going on between these two was so bad, it was causing problems with the whole church. And I can imagine that it was dividing people, and some people are taking one person's side and some people are taking another, and it's bad. And Paul writes to the congregation that they needed to help these women be of the same mind. And we don't know what's going on, but I think he's trying to point out to these two, Euodia and Syntyche, that they're not as much at odds as they think they are. He's telling them, be gentle with each other. He's telling them to focus on the good thing that they're trying to do, and maybe not get caught up in stories they're telling about the other person. To be honest, Carl, forgive me if I'm being too bold. It sounds a lot like what you and Evelyn are going through. I can almost guarantee Evelyn wants to do just as good a job with this rummage sale as you do. The problem is not that neither one of you care. The problem is that you're not talking to each other, finding out how much each other care about this. Both of you understand how important this thing is, but I wonder if you're both just so scared you're going to mess it up that you're not listening to each other. Carl sat still for a long time after that. He stared up at the ceiling. Julian knew enough to not interrupt whatever was going on in the man's mind, and it had given him the chance to admit that the little sermon he had just given was actually for him too. I mean, how many times had he been caught up in his own fears and anxieties and ruined something good? If he was honest, half the arguments he had with people, particularly his wife, were probably because he didn't like people telling him what to do. Not that it happens all that often, but he knew that he should probably buy Sarah a card on the way home. Carl took a deep breath. You know, Pastor, I've been sitting here thinking. In that first meeting we had, Evelyn said something about me trying to reinvent the wheel, and I got pretty hurt by that. I've spent a few weeks being hurt by that. Like I wasn't taking things serious enough. Then I got to admit, she probably wouldn't have said that if I hadn't made the comment about how we had an opportunity this year to do the rummage sale in a way that wasn't so dadgum boring. I forgot she's chaired this event in the past. That probably didn't make her feel too good. I think you're probably right, Carl. I don't think that made her feel too good. And then Carl Wilkins slapped his knees and stood up. Well, got to go fix this. And the man who had been a puddle a moment before transformed back into that giant that Julian came to know. Thanks, Pastor. I'll be talking to you. And he barreled out of the office. Cheryl poked her head in. She said, "What did you do to him?" Julian said, "I don't know. I just told him a Bible story." 3.5 weeks later, the annual First Presbyterian rummage sale went off without a hitch, we are pleased to report. There were some minor changes. There was a play area for the kids. There was bobbing for apples, hot apple cider, and yes, there was a dunk take with the pastor involved. But the core of the event was as well run as it had always been. And it was as successful too when the rummage sale committee stood up in worship to announce that they had raised over $12,000 for the missions work of the church. The thing that actually brought a smile to Julian's face more than anything was watching Evelyn and Carl trip all over themselves to thank one another for their hard work. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is anything of excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Amen. Thanks be to God.